Not just on my shoulders, and I don't really want that. I don't want to be like up there for 2 hours, 3 hours.
If you know anything about rock and roll history, you know Ringo Starr stands at the very top as the legendary drummer who kept the beat for the Beatles. For over 6 decades, fans watched him spread his iconic peace and love message alongside John, Paul, and George, assuming his closest bonds were strictly tied to his famous bandmates and his decades-long marriage to Barbara Bach. But behind his cheerful smile and decades in the spotlight lies a deeply personal list of inner-circle relationships that shaped his life far away from the cameras. Now, at 86, Ringo Starr finally opened up about the inner circle who meant the world to him, revealing the 6 people he loved most in his entire life. So, who are the 6 people who truly held Ringo Starr's heart through all these years? Let's dive in. Maureen Cox. Long before Ringo Starr became one of the most recognizable musicians on the planet, there was a young woman in Liverpool who knew him simply as Richard Starkey. Her name was Maureen Cox, and she entered his life before Beatlemania turned everything upside down. That is part of what made their relationship so significant. Maureen did not fall in love with the global superstar Ringo Starr. She knew the man before the world did. The two met in the early 1960s, when Maureen was a young hairdresser and a regular around the Cavern Club, where the Beatles were performing. She had noticed Ringo and developed a crush on him, but their relationship eventually became much more than the admiration of a teenage fan. Ringo noticed her too, and before long, the two were dating. At the time, Ringo was still building his career with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, but everything was about to change. When Ringo joined the Beatles in 1962, Maureen suddenly found herself in a relationship with a man whose life was moving at extraordinary speed. Within a few years, the quiet Liverpool drummer she had known was traveling the world, performing before enormous crowds and becoming one of the most famous men alive. Yet Maureen remained beside him through that transformation. There was something deeply personal about their connection, because she had known him before the screaming fans and international headlines. She had seen the ordinary man behind the drums, and that familiarity mattered. Fame could surround Ringo, but Maureen belonged to the part of his life that existed before the fame became overwhelming. By 1965, Ringo knew he wanted to marry her. He proposed at London's Ad Lib Club, and Maureen accepted. Just weeks later, on February 11, 1965, they were married at Caxton Hall. The wedding attracted enormous attention because Ringo was now a Beatle. But underneath all the publicity was a young couple trying to build a family, while one of the most extraordinary periods in popular music was unfolding around them. Their marriage soon became a family of 5. They had 3 children together, Zach, Jason, and Lee, and becoming a father was clearly important to Ringo. The children gave him something outside the madness of the Beatles, something that belonged to him rather than to the public. In fact, during the Beatles' famous 1968 trip to India, Ringo eventually returned home early, with his family and his children being among the things pulling him back. But their marriage was not a fairy tale, and pretending otherwise would make their story less meaningful, not more. The enormous pressures surrounding Ringo's life, along with his infidelity, drinking, and other personal struggles, placed serious strain on the relationship. Maureen and Ringo eventually separated, and their divorce was finalized in 1975. Even after the marriage ended, however, Maureen did not simply disappear from Ringo's life. They had spent more than a decade together, raised 3 children, and experienced the rise of the Beatles side by side. There were painful chapters, including the complicated situation involving George Harrison, but the history between Ringo and Maureen was far too deep to be reduced to the reasons their marriage failed. What makes their story particularly moving is what happened years later. In 1994, Maureen was diagnosed with leukemia. By then, she and Ringo had been divorced for almost 2 decades, and both had moved forward with their lives. Yet when Maureen became seriously ill, Ringo was there. He visited her during her final days and remained close to their children as they faced her death. Maureen died in December 1994 at the age of 47. That final chapter says something important about the kind of love Ringo had for her. Their marriage had ended, but the years they shared could not simply be erased. Maureen had been there before the fame, during the height of Beatlemania, through the birth of their children, and during some of the most chaotic years of his life. She knew Ringo before he became an icon, and she remained connected to him long after they stopped being husband and wife. Perhaps that is why Maureen belongs among the people Ringo loved most. Their relationship was complicated, imperfect, and ultimately heartbreaking. But it was also real. She was his first great love, the mother of his children, and one of the few people who could say she knew Richard Starkey before the entire world knew Ringo Starr. And sometimes, the people who knew you before you became famous leave a mark that fame can never erase. Barbara Bach. If Maureen Cox represented the life Ringo Starr had before fame completely changed him, Barbara Bach became something very different. The woman who met him after the chaos had already happened and still chose to stay. By the time Ringo met Barbara, he was no longer the young drummer from Liverpool who had suddenly found himself inside the Beatles. He had already experienced worldwide fame, the collapse of his first marriage, personal struggles, and years of living under a level of attention most people could never understand. Then, almost unexpectedly, he met an actress who seemed to understand that world better than most. Ringo and Barbara first met in 1980 while working on the film Caveman. Barbara was an established actress, best known internationally for playing Bond girl Anya Amasova in The Spy Who Loved Me. Ringo was appearing in the comedy alongside her, and what began as 2 performers working on the same movie quickly became something much more serious. There was an obvious difference between Barbara and the people Ringo had known earlier in his life. She was not discovering him for the first time as a Beatle. She already understood what it meant to live with fame. She had experienced the pressure of being a recognizable actress herself, so she could understand the strange world Ringo inhabited without needing to turn him into an attraction. The relationship moved surprisingly quickly. Ringo and Barbara married on April 27, 1981, just months after meeting. Their wedding was held at London's Marylebone Register Office, with Ringo's son Zach and Barbara's daughter Francesca among those present. By that point, the two had decided they wanted something permanent. And perhaps the most important thing Barbara brought into Ringo's life was stability. Their marriage came during a period when Ringo was trying to move away from some of the destructive habits that had followed him through the previous decade. Both Ringo and Barbara eventually became sober, and they have spoken publicly about how important that decision was to their lives together. Instead of allowing their pasts to define them, they built a new routine around each other. That became one of the defining characteristics of their marriage. They were not simply 2 famous people who happened to marry. They became partners who deliberately chose a quieter, healthier life. Ringo has repeatedly spoken about how much he loves and admires Barbara, and one of the things that stands out is how often he describes their relationship in terms of companionship. They travel together, work on projects together, and have remained closely connected despite spending decades in the public eye. For someone whose life had once been consumed by Beatlemania, that kind of private stability was enormously valuable. Barbara also became part of Ringo's creative world. She appeared in his music video for Give Peace a Chance and has supported his all-star band career, while the two have continued to make public appearances together over the years. But their relationship has never depended entirely on being seen together. Much of what has kept them together has happened away from the cameras. Ringo has even credited Barbara with helping him become a better version of himself. Their relationship gave him a sense of home after years in which almost everything around him seemed temporary. The Beatles had ended. His first marriage had ended. His career had gone through its own ups and downs, but Barbara remained. There is also something significant about the timing of their relationship. Barbara did not meet Ringo when he was a carefree young musician at the height of Beatlemania. She met him when he had already lived through the consequences of becoming famous too quickly. She knew the man who existed after the fantasy had faded, and she still loved him. That may be why their marriage has lasted for more than 4 decades. Ringo and Barbara have now spent longer together than either of them spent in many of the earlier chapters of their lives. They have celebrated birthdays, endured difficult periods, supported each other's careers, and watched their families grow. Through all of it, they have maintained the friendship underneath the marriage. For Ringo, that appears to be what makes Barbara so important. She is not simply the woman he married after the Beatles. She is the person who stayed when the noise died down. After experiencing a marriage that ended painfully and a life that had been shaped by extraordinary fame, Ringo found in Barbara something he had not always had before, a partner with whom he could grow older. And perhaps that is the simplest explanation for why she remains one of the great loves of his life. She did not love only the Beatle. She loved the man who came after him too, John Lennon. John Lennon was not simply Ringo Starr's bandmate. He was one of the people who helped make Ringo feel that he belonged in the Beatles in the first place. When Ringo joined the group in 1962, he was stepping into a band that already had a history, a tight friendship, and a very strong identity. John could have treated the new drummer as an outsider. Instead, Ringo quickly became part of the inner circle, and over the years, the relationship between the two men grew into something much deeper than a professional partnership. Ringo had already established himself as one of Liverpool's respected drummers when Brian Epstein and the Beatles came calling. He knew John, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison from the local music scene, and the Beatles had actually encountered him several times while he was playing with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. When Pete Best was replaced, Ringo was the drummer they wanted. That decision changed both his career and his relationship with John forever. John was famously quick-witted, sarcastic, and sometimes difficult, but he also had a softer side that people close to him saw clearly. With Ringo, there was a particular kind of affection built around humor. The two could tease each other, joke around, and behave like friends rather than two men carrying the weight of the biggest band in the world. Ringo also had a quality that fit naturally with John. He was not interested in competing with him. He did not need to dominate a room or prove that he was the cleverest person there. Ringo had his own dry sense of humor and could give John as good as he got. That made their friendship feel surprisingly relaxed, considering the pressure surrounding them. But the relationship was not only about jokes. During the Beatles' years, Ringo became particularly close to John and the other members of the group because they were experiencing something almost impossible together. They were recording albums, touring the world, dealing with screaming crowds, and watching their private lives disappear under constant public attention. Whatever arguments happened inside the group, there was a bond created by having gone through all of it together. When the Beatles stopped touring in 1966, their friendship continued through the studio years. Ringo and John worked together on countless recordings, And even after the Beatles officially broke up, they continued to cross paths musically. That became especially important after the breakup, because Ringo did not simply abandon the relationships he had built during the Beatles' years. He remained friendly with all three former bandmates, and John continued to have a place in his life. In 1973, Ringo released his album Ringo, and John contributed the song I'm the Greatest. Paul and George also participated in the project in different ways, making it one of those rare moments when several former Beatles were once again connected through music. John's involvement was particularly meaningful because the song itself had a playful connection to Beatles history. It allowed the old friends to step back into something familiar without pretending that the past had never changed. Ringo also became one of the people John trusted enough to remain in contact with after the Beatles' breakup. The friendship survived distance, changing careers, and the complicated relationships that developed between the former bandmates. Then came December 1980. John was murdered outside his home in New York, and Ringo was suddenly forced to confront the loss of someone who had been part of his life since he was a young musician in Liverpool. Ringo later spoke about how devastating John's death was and how difficult it was to accept that his friend was gone. One of the most touching things about Ringo's connection to John is that he never seemed interested in turning their friendship into some grand mythology. He remembered John as a person, a funny man, a complicated man, a friend who could be irritating one minute and incredibly warm the next. That is also why John belongs among the people Ringo loved most. Their relationship was forged before either man fully understood what the Beatles would become. They went from young musicians playing in Liverpool to members of the most famous band in history, and somehow, beneath all the fame, they retained the familiarity of the two people who had known each other before the world was watching. John Lennon was part of the extraordinary chapter of Ringo's life that could never be repeated. And although the Beatles ended and John's life was tragically cut short, Ringo never stopped carrying that friendship with him. For Ringo, John was not simply the legendary Beatle the world remembers. He was his friend, his bandmate, and one of the people who had shared the madness with him from the beginning. George Harrison. George Harrison was more than Ringo Starr's fellow Beatle. He was one of the people who knew Ringo through almost every version of his adult life, from the hungry young musicians trying to make their way in Liverpool to the worldwide fame of the Beatles and the years that followed when the band was gone. Their friendship had its disagreements and complicated moments, but underneath all of that was a genuine affection that lasted until George's death. Ringo already knew George before he became a Beatle. Both men came from Liverpool's music scene, and Ringo had encountered George when they were still young musicians trying to make a name for themselves. George was younger, but he had already developed a reputation as a serious guitarist. By the time Ringo joined the Beatles in 1962, the two men were about to become part of a friendship that would shape the rest of their lives. One reason Ringo and George connected so well was their personalities. Neither needed to be the loudest person in the room. George could be intensely private and thoughtful, while Ringo was known for his humor and laid-back personality. That made their friendship different from the more volatile relationships inside the Beatles. They could joke around, work together, and give each other space. And George was one of the people who seemed to genuinely appreciate Ringo's personality, rather than simply his role as the drummer. During the Beatles' years, George and Ringo became close enough that their relationship continued even outside the studio. George was also a major supporter of Ringo's solo career after the Beatles broke apart. When Ringo began making records on his own, George contributed as a musician and songwriter, helping him establish an identity beyond the band that had made him famous. One of the clearest examples came with Ringo's 1973 album, Ringo. George contributed to the record, just as John Lennon and Paul McCartney did, creating one of those extraordinary moments when all four Beatles were connected to the same project, even though the band itself no longer existed. But their friendship was not limited to music. George and Ringo shared an unusual sense of humor, and Ringo often spoke warmly about George's personality. There was a familiarity between them that came from years of knowing each other's habits, weaknesses, and personalities. They had experienced the same extraordinary pressures, traveled together, and watched their lives change beyond recognition. That shared history became even more important after the Beatles ended. While the four former bandmates sometimes struggled with one another, Ringo maintained relationships with all of them. George remained particularly important in his life, and the two continued seeing each other and collaborating. Their friendship had become independent of the Beatles. There was, however, one complicated chapter that could easily have destroyed that bond. During Ringo's troubled marriage to Maureen Cox, George became involved with Maureen, and the situation deeply complicated the friendships and relationships surrounding all three of them. It was an uncomfortable and painful part of their history, particularly because George and Ringo were supposed to be friends. Yet somehow, the friendship survived. That says something about how deeply connected the two men were. They were capable of hurting each other, disagreeing and moving through difficult periods without completely throwing away the decades of history between them. And when George became seriously ill, Ringo's affection for him became unmistakable. In November 2001, while Ringo was in Boston preparing for surgery, he learned that George was nearing the end of his battle with cancer. Ringo later recalled traveling to see him, along with his wife, Barbara Bach. George was seriously ill, but Ringo wanted to be there. It would be one of the last times the two friends saw each other. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. For Ringo, the loss was devastating. He had already lost John Lennon 2 decades earlier, and now another piece of the Beatles' story was gone. But Ringo's memories of George have never been defined only by his death. He has continued to speak about him with affection, remembering the humor, the music, and the friendship they shared. Perhaps that is why George belongs among the people Ringo loved most. He was there before the world knew their names, remained beside Ringo after the Beatles disappeared, supported his music, and shared more than a decade of experiences that neither man could ever fully explain to anyone who had not lived through them. George was not perfect, and neither was their friendship. But real love between friends does not require perfection. Sometimes it survives mistakes, arguments, distance, and even heartbreak, because the history underneath it is simply too deep to throw away. For Ringo, George was one of those rare people who could understand the life he had lived because he had lived it too. And when George was gone, Ringo lost not just a former Beatle, but one of the friends who had been there from the very beginning. Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr spent some of the most extraordinary years of their lives side by side. But their relationship was never as simple as two friends who happened to play in the same band. They met when both were young musicians in Liverpool, long before either could have imagined that they would become two of the most famous people in music history. What began as a professional relationship eventually became something much closer to family. And even when the Beatles fell apart, the bond between them proved difficult to break. Ringo already knew Paul through Liverpool's music scene before he officially became a Beatle. Paul and John Lennon had formed the nucleus of the Beatles, while Ringo was making a name for himself as the drummer of Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Their paths crossed repeatedly because Liverpool's musicians moved through the same clubs and venues. So when Ringo joined the Beatles in 1962, he was not walking into a room full of complete strangers. He was joining musicians he already knew. But everything changed once the four men became the Beatles. Paul and Ringo developed a particularly easy chemistry. Paul was intensely focused on the music and often demanding in the studio, while Ringo had a more relaxed personality and an instinct for making people laugh. That contrast worked. Paul could push the band toward perfection, while Ringo brought a looseness and warmth that helped keep the atmosphere from becoming completely consumed by pressure. And musically, Paul understood exactly what Ringo could contribute. Ringo was not the kind of drummer who wanted to overwhelm a song with complicated displays of technique. His strength was serving the song, finding the right rhythm, and making the performance feel natural. Paul recognized that quality and frequently wrote with Ringo's playing in mind. The two developed an understanding that allowed them to work together without Ringo needing to compete with Paul. Their friendship also grew outside the recording studio. They traveled together, lived through Beatlemania together, and watched the world become increasingly obsessed with their private lives. They were four young men who suddenly had almost no privacy, and that shared experience created a bond that outsiders could never completely understand. But by the late 1960s, the atmosphere inside the Beatles had changed dramatically. The band members were older, their individual ambitions were becoming stronger, and tensions were increasingly difficult to hide. When the Beatles finally broke up, the relationships between the four men became complicated. Ringo and Paul were not immune to that tension. There were disagreements, harsh words, and periods when they were not particularly close. The breakup was not simply the end of a band. It was the collapse of a partnership that had shaped their entire adult lives. Each man had to figure out how to move forward while carrying the enormous weight of everything they had accomplished together. Yet, the friendship never completely disappeared. Ringo and Paul continued working together after the Beatles. Paul contributed to Ringo's solo records, while Ringo appeared on Paul's projects. Their collaborations became reminders that despite everything that had happened, the musical connection between them was still there. One of the most meaningful examples came in 1973, when Ringo released his album, Ringo. Paul contributed the song 6 O'Clock, while Ringo's record also included contributions from John and George. For a brief moment, the four Beatles were once again connected through music. That history became even more precious after John Lennon was murdered in 1980 and George Harrison died in 2001. With two of their closest friends gone, Paul and Ringo became the last surviving members of the group that had changed the world. That reality brought a different dimension to their relationship. They were no longer simply former bandmates. They were the only two people alive who could fully understand what it had been like to stand inside the Beatles at the height of Beatlemania. No matter how many documentaries were made or books were written, there were certain memories that belonged only to them. In later years, their friendship became noticeably warmer and more public. They appeared together, celebrated Beatles projects, and continued supporting one another's music. Paul has repeatedly spoken about his affection for Ringo, while Ringo has described Paul as his brother. And that word matters, because their relationship survived something that destroys many friendships: enormous success, enormous pressure, creative disagreements, personal conflict, and the breakup of a partnership that had once seemed unstoppable. Ringo loves Paul not because their relationship was always perfect, but because Paul has been part of his life for more than 60 years. He was there when Ringo was still trying to establish himself as a musician. He was there when four young men from Liverpool became the Beatles. He remained connected through the difficult years afterward, and today he is one of the only people who can look across the decades and genuinely say, "We were there." For Ringo, Paul is more than the former Beatle who played bass beside him. He is one of the last living links to the life they built together, and after everything they have been through, that kind of bond is almost impossible to replace. Richard Starkey Sr. Before there was Ringo Starr, before the Beatles, before the screaming crowds and the millions of records, there was simply Richard Starkey, a boy growing up in Liverpool with a complicated relationship with his father. Richard Starkey Sr. was one of the most important people in Ringo's early life, even though he was not always physically present in it. And that complicated beginning makes the place his father held in Ringo's heart particularly interesting. Richard Starkey Sr. married Elsie Gleave, and together they had their only child, Richard Starkey Jr., who would later become Ringo Starr. The family lived in the Dingle area of Liverpool, where Ringo spent his early childhood. His father worked as a confectioner's decorator and later took other jobs, while his mother worked to support the family. But the marriage did not last. When Ringo was still very young, his parents separated, and his father largely disappeared from his everyday life. For a child, that kind of absence can leave a complicated mark. Ringo grew up primarily with his mother, Elsie, who became the central figure in his childhood. His father was still part of his story, but not in the way most children experience a father. Years later, Ringo would talk about his father with a mixture of affection, distance, and understanding, rather than simple resentment. That is what makes their relationship so interesting. Richard Sr. was not there for many of the childhood moments that shaped his son. He missed much of Ringo's difficult early years, including the serious illnesses that kept the young boy in hospital for long periods. Ringo suffered from tuberculosis as a child and spent extended periods away from home recovering. His mother was the person who remained by his side through those difficult years. But despite the distance, Ringo never completely erased his father from his life. As Ringo became famous, Richard Sr. remained connected to the family, and eventually the two men were able to rebuild a relationship that had been missing during much of Ringo's childhood. That reconciliation mattered because Ringo was no longer the little boy waiting for his father to be around. He was an adult who could finally understand the circumstances surrounding his parents' separation from a different perspective. There was also something else that connected them: Liverpool. Richard Sr. remained a part of the world Ringo had come from, the same working-class Liverpool environment that shaped the personality and humor Ringo carried throughout his life. Before the world knew him as Ringo Starr, he was Richard Starkey, the son of Elsie and Richard, growing up in a neighborhood where life was far removed from the glamorous image that would eventually surround him. And perhaps that is one reason Ringo continued to feel affection for his father despite everything. Richard Sr. had given him his name, his roots, and a connection to the life that existed before fame. The Beatles could make Ringo a global celebrity, but they could never change where he came from. Their relationship was never a perfect father-son story. In fact, it would be misleading to pretend that it was. Richard Sr.'s absence was a significant part of Ringo's childhood, and the years they lost could never be recovered. But Ringo's feelings toward him seemed to become less about judging the past and more about accepting it. That became particularly important as Ringo grew older. The older he became, the more he seemed to understand that people could be complicated. His own life had given him plenty of reasons to understand that. He had experienced failed relationships, personal struggles, enormous success, and periods when he himself had not always been the person he wanted to be. That perspective may have allowed him to look at his father with greater compassion. Richard Starkey Sr. died in 1967, while Ringo was still at the height of Beatlemania. His death came at a strange point in Ringo's life. The world was watching the Beatles become more famous than anyone could have imagined. But privately, Ringo had lost his father. And that contrast captures something important about their relationship. Richard Sr. may not have been the father who was present for every childhood milestone, but he remained part of the man Ringo became. Their story was shaped as much by absence as by affection, and perhaps that is why Ringo's feelings toward him were so complicated. Ringo's love for his father was not the uncomplicated love of a son who had been given everything he needed. It was the love of someone who had grown old enough to understand that a person's importance in your life is not always measured by how often they were physically there. What name on the list surprised you the most? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.